The sun blazed mercilessly over the Arizona territory as Ayanna crouched behind a cluster of prickly pear cacti, her dark eyes tracking the movements of 3 cowboys near the watering hole. Her muscular frame, hardened by years of survival in the desert, remained perfectly still, despite the mockery she'd endured just hours before at their camp. The men had laughed when she'd approached seeking information about her missing brother, calling her more man than woman, and suggesting she'd never find a husband among her people. Their crude jokes about her broad shoulders and calloused hands had echoed across the camp, but Ayanna had said nothing, storing their words like arrows in a quiver. She knew that sometimes silence was the sharpest weapon of all. The youngest cowboy, barely past his 20th year, spat into the dust and adjusted his worn hat. "That Apache girl sure was something else, wasn't she, Jake?" he called to his companion, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth. Jake laughed, the sound harsh against the desert silence, and replied, "Hell, Tommy, I ain't sure that was a girl at all. Built like a bull and twice as mean-looking." The third man, older and quieter than the others, continued watering the horses without comment. His name was Samuel, and unlike his companions, he'd served in the cavalry and knew better than to underestimate any Apache, regardless of gender. Ayanna's jaw tightened as their words carried on the wind, but her focus remained on the prize grazing just beyond their makeshift camp. A magnificent black stallion, wild and untamed, had been drinking from a stream that fed into the main water source. The animal was clearly unbroken, its coat gleaming like obsidian in the afternoon light, muscles rippling beneath skin that had never known saddle or bridle. She'd been tracking this horse for 3 days, knowing that capturing such a prize would not only provide her band with a valuable asset, but would also serve another purpose entirely. The stallion represented something the white men couldn't understand, the harmony between strength and grace, power and beauty. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, speaking the old words about the connection between Apache women and the horses that roamed their ancestral lands. "Ayanna," the elder had said, using her granddaughter's name, which meant eternal blossom, "the spirits of the wild horses choose their riders as much as riders choose them." The girl had inherited more than just her grandmother's name. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to communicate with horses, a gift that had manifested early in her childhood. While other children played with wooden dolls, Ayanna had been taming colts and learning the ancient songs that calmed even the most spirited mustangs. This connection to the animal world had made her an invaluable member of her band, but it had also set her apart in ways that sometimes brought loneliness. The Cowboys had set up their temporary camp near what they believed was an abandoned Apache settlement, unaware that Ayanna's people still considered this sacred ground. Their campfire sent smoke signals into the clear sky, inadvertently announcing their presence to any Apache scout within miles. Samuel, the veteran, occasionally glanced toward the surrounding rocks and mesas, his military training making him more cautious than his younger companions. Jake and Tommy, however, were focused on their card game and the whiskey they'd brought from the last town, their voices growing louder and more careless as the afternoon wore on. They had no idea they were being watched by someone who could move through the desert as silently as a shadow. The stallion lifted its magnificent head, nostrils flaring as it caught a scent on the shifting wind. Ayanna recognized the signs immediately. The horse had detected her presence, but wasn't alarmed, merely curious. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the opportunity to demonstrate that her connection to the animal world ran deeper than these white men could comprehend. She began to move, not toward the Cowboys' camp, but in a wide circle that would bring her closer to the stallion without alerting the men to her presence. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled, as she employed hunting techniques passed down through generations of Apache warriors and scouts. Her leather moccasins made no sound against the desert floor as she navigated between thorny mesquite bushes and weathered stones. The traditional Apache clothing she wore, a buckskin dress decorated with turquoise beads and silver conchos, allowed for complete freedom of movement while providing protection against the harsh environment. Around her waist, she wore a belt that held a bone-handled knife, a gift from her father before he'd been killed in a skirmish with cavalry soldiers 2 winters past. The memory of his death fueled her determination now, not for revenge, but for the need to prove that Apache strength came in many forms. She would show these cowboys what a man-woman could accomplish when she set her mind to it. The stallion had moved closer to the camp, drawn perhaps by the scent of the cowboys' grain-fed horses or simply by curiosity about these intruders in its territory. Ayanna could see the intelligence in its eyes, the wildness that spoke of generations running free across these ancient lands. This was no ordinary horse. It was a leader, probably the dominant stallion of a herd that had managed to evade capture by remaining in the most remote areas of the desert. The animal's coat bore no scars from ropes or whips, no marks of human domination, and its proud bearing suggested it had never submitted to any rider. Capturing such a creature would require more than brute force or clever traps. It would demand a meeting of spirits, a recognition of mutual respect between predator and prey. Jake's laughter cut through the afternoon heat as he won another hand of cards, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding just beyond their camp's perimeter. "I tell you, boys," he drawled, "that Apache gal was probably the ugliest woman I ever did see. No wonder her people sent her out alone. Probably can't stand the sight of her neither." Tommy nodded agreement, too drunk on whiskey and bravado to notice Samuel's disapproving expression or the way the older man's hand had instinctively moved closer to his revolver. The veteran had learned to trust his instincts during his years fighting Apache warriors, and something about this place felt wrong, felt watched. He couldn't shake the feeling that their crude jokes about the Apache woman might have consequences they weren't prepared to face. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Ayanna prepared to make her move. The stallion had positioned itself perfectly, close enough to the camp to ensure the cowboys would witness what was about to happen, but far enough away to provide room for the delicate dance that would either result in triumph or disaster. She removed a length of woven rope from her belt, not the harsh hemp favored by white horse breakers, but a traditional Apache creation made from plant fibers and blessed by the tribal medicine man. Her plan was audacious, dangerous, and would require every skill she'd learned from her grandmother and the elders who'd taught her the old ways. In moments, these mocking cowboys would discover exactly what kind of woman they'd insulted, and the wild stallion would choose its own fate. Ayanna began to sing, her voice barely above a whisper, weaving the ancient Apache horse songs that her grandmother had taught her in the shadow of sacred mountains. The melody was older than memory, passed down through countless generations of women who had understood that horses were not beasts to be broken, but spirits to be invited into partnership. The stallion's ears pricked forward at the sound, its powerful body going still as the haunting notes drifted across the desert air. Even the cowboys' conversation seemed to fade as something primal and ancient stirred in the space between human and animal. Jake paused mid-sentence, his cards forgotten, as an inexplicable chill ran down his spine despite the blazing heat. The black stallion took a tentative step toward the source of the song, its nostrils flaring as it tested the air for danger. Ayanna could see the conflict in its dark eyes, the wild instinct to flee, warring against an older, deeper recognition of the melody that spoke to something in its blood. She continued her approach, each movement flowing like water over stone, her feet finding the rhythm of the song as she drew closer to the magnificent creature. The rope in her hands felt alive, warm with the energy of generations of Apache horse whisperers who had used similar tools not to capture, but to communicate. Her voice grew slightly stronger, incorporating clicks and soft calls that horses understood as surely as they understood the language of wind and water. "What in the Sam Hill is that noise?" Tommy muttered, looking up from his cards with bleary, whiskey-dulled eyes. Samuel had risen to his feet, his hand resting on his gun belt as he scanned the surrounding landscape with the practiced eye of a former soldier. The older man's face had gone pale beneath its weathered tan, and Jake could see genuine concern in his expression. "That's Apache singing," Samuel said quietly, his voice tight with recognition and something that might have been respect. "And if we can hear it, that means whoever's doing the singing wants us to hear it." The implications of his words hung heavy in the desert air as the three men finally began to understand they were no longer alone. The stallion had moved closer still, drawn by the hypnotic power of Ayana's voice and the strange calm that seemed to emanate from her very being. She could see her reflection in its intelligent eyes, but more than that, she could feel the horse's spirit reaching out to touch hers in the way that only the truly wild creatures could manage. This was the moment of truth, the instant when all her training and natural gifts would either prove sufficient or fail entirely. She extended her hand slowly, palm up, allowing the stallion to catch her scent, while continuing the ancient song that had once tamed the first horses on the endless plains. The rope remained coiled at her side, present but not threatening, a tool of partnership rather than domination. Jake scrambled to his feet, knocking over his whiskey bottle in his haste, the amber liquid disappearing into the thirsty desert sand. "I don't like this," he said, his earlier bravado replaced by something approaching fear as he finally grasped that the Apache woman they'd mocked was somewhere nearby. Tommy tried to stand but stumbled, his legs unsteady from drink and sudden anxiety, while Samuel remained perfectly still, recognizing that any sudden movement might trigger consequences none of them were prepared to face. The veteran had seen Apache warriors in action and knew that underestimating any member of that proud nation could prove fatal. His respect for their skills had been earned through bitter experience during his cavalry days. The stallion extended its muzzle toward Ayana's outstretched hand, the moment of contact sending an electric thrill through both human and horse. She felt the warm breath against her palm, smelled the clean, wild scent of an animal that had never known captivity, and in that instant, she knew she had been chosen as surely as she had chosen. The rope seemed to move of its own accord, flowing through her hands like liquid silver as she created a simple loop, not a lasso meant to trap, but a gentle collar that spoke of invitation rather than compulsion. The stallion stood perfectly still as she slipped the rope around its neck, its dark eyes reflecting an understanding that transcended the barriers between species. This was not capture. This was covenant. Tommy's jaw dropped open as he watched the impossible scene unfolding before them, the whiskey haze clearing enough for him to recognize that he was witnessing something beyond his comprehension. She's actually doing it," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. Jake cursed under his breath, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him as the woman they dismissed as barely human demonstrated a mastery over wild animals that seemed almost supernatural. Samuel nodded grimly, his military training allowing him to appreciate the skill and courage required for such a feat, while also recognizing the implicit message being sent to them. The Apache woman was demonstrating exactly what she was capable of, and the lesson was as clear as desert sunlight. With fluid grace that spoke of years spent among horses, Ayana swung onto the stallion's back without saddle or bridle, her body moving in perfect harmony with the animal's powerful frame. The horse tensed for a moment, its wild instincts warring against the strange new sensation, but the continuing sound of her voice and the gentle pressure of her legs communicated reassurance rather than dominance. She had become part of the horse, her spirit joining with its own in the ancient dance of mutual trust that her people had perfected over countless generations. The stallion took a few experimental steps, testing this new partnership, and finding it acceptable, broke into a smooth trot that carried them both toward the Cowboys' camp. The sight of the Apache woman riding bareback on the magnificent wild stallion struck the three men like a physical blow, each understanding in his own way that they were witnessing something that would haunt their dreams and challenge their assumptions for years to come. Jake's face had gone ashen as he realized the full implications of their earlier mockery. They had insulted not just any woman, but one whose connection to the natural world made their own skills look clumsy and primitive by comparison. Tommy stood frozen, his mouth still hanging open, while Samuel slowly removed his hat in a gesture of respect that his military experience had taught him to give to superior warriors regardless of their gender or race. The desert seemed to hold its breath as horse and rider approached. Ayanna guided the stallion to within 20 feet of the Cowboys' camp, close enough for them to see every detail of her triumph, but far enough to maintain safety for both herself and her new partner. She sat straight and proud, her long black hair flowing like a banner in the desert wind, her dark eyes meeting each man's gaze in turn, with the quiet confidence of someone who had just proven herself beyond any shadow of doubt. The stallion stood perfectly still beneath her, its powerful muscles relaxed, its breathing steady, as if it had been born to carry this particular rider across the ancient lands of the Apache nation. Without speaking a word, she had delivered a message more eloquent than any speech about the true nature of Apache strength and the foolishness of those who judged others by their own limited understanding of what it meant to be human. The silence stretched between them like a taut bowstring until Samuel finally found his voice, stepping forward with the careful movements of a man who recognized he was in the presence of something extraordinary. "Miss," he said, his tone respectful in a way that made his companions stare at him in surprise. "That was the finest piece of horsemanship I've ever witnessed, and I've seen cavalry officers who trained their whole lives never come close to what you just accomplished." His words carried the weight of genuine admiration, earned through years of military service that had taught him to recognize true skill regardless of its source. Jake and Tommy exchanged confused glances, still struggling to reconcile their earlier mockery with the undeniable evidence of Ayanna's remarkable abilities. The desert wind stirred the dust around the stallion's hooves as if nature itself was holding its breath. Ayanna remained mounted, her posture regal as any queen's, letting the moment stretch until she was certain her message had been delivered with crystal clarity. When she finally spoke, her English was perfect, flavored with the musical cadences of her native tongue, but precise in a way that made it clear she had understood every cruel word they'd spoken earlier. "Your words this morning suggested you believed Apache women to be less than human," she said, her voice carrying across the camp like the whisper of wind through canyon walls. "Perhaps now you understand that it is not we who are diminished by your judgment, but you who are diminished by your ignorance." The stallion shifted beneath her, responding to some subtle signal, its dark coat gleaming in the afternoon sun, as if it too understood the significance of this moment. Jake's face flushed red with shame as the full impact of her words hit him, his earlier bravado crumbling like adobe in a flash flood. He removed his hat and looked down at his boots, unable to meet her steady gaze, while Tommy continued to stare in open-mouthed amazement at the sight before him. Samuel nodded slowly, recognizing the justice in her rebuke and the grace with which she delivered it. "You're absolutely right, miss," the veteran said, his voice heavy with regret. "We spoke ignorantly and cruelly, and we owe you an apology that words probably can't adequately express." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and painful, as the three men grappled with the uncomfortable truth that their prejudices had blinded them to the remarkable woman who now sat before them like a vision from another world. The stallion began to move in a slow circle around the camp, its gait smooth as flowing water, responding to pressures so subtle that the cowboys couldn't detect them, even as they watched intently for any sign of how Ayanna controlled the magnificent beast. She rode as if she and the horse shared a single mind, her body moving in perfect harmony with its rhythm, demonstrating a partnership that transcended anything they had ever seen between human and animal. "This horse chose me," she said, her voice carrying easily over the soft sound of hooves on sand. "Just as I chose him. Among my people, we understand that true strength comes not from forcing others to submit, but from earning the trust and respect that makes submission unnecessary." Her words carried layers of meaning that went far beyond horsemanship, speaking to the fundamental differences between Apache and white approaches to power and relationships. As they completed another circuit of the camp, Ayana's sharp eyes caught sight of something that made her heart race with sudden hope and equally sudden dread. There, hanging from Samuel's saddle horn, was a distinctive beaded pouch that she recognized immediately. It had belonged to her younger brother Nalnish, who had disappeared 3 weeks ago while scouting near the Mexican border. The geometric patterns worked into the leather by their grandmother's skilled hands were unmistakable, as unique as a signature, and seeing it in the possession of these white men sent a chill through her despite the desert heat. She brought the stallion to a halt directly in front of Samuel, her dark eyes fixed on the pouch with an intensity that made the veteran's hand instinctively move toward his weapon before he caught himself. The moment had shifted from demonstration to something far more serious and potentially dangerous. "That pouch," Ayana said, her voice now carrying an edge that made all 3 men tense visibly. "Where did you acquire it?" The question was deceptively calm, but Samuel's military experience allowed him to recognize the coiled tension behind her words, the way a warrior might ask about the origins of a scalp or a weapon taken from the dead. He looked down at the beaded bag hanging from his saddle, his mind racing as he tried to remember how it had come into his possession while also preparing for whatever might come next. Jake and Tommy had gone very still, finally understanding that this encounter had moved beyond simple embarrassment into territory that could prove lethal if handled badly. The stallion sensed its rider's tension and began to prance, its earlier calm replaced by the alertness of a predator ready to flee or fight. Samuel's weathered face went pale as memory flooded back, bringing with it a story that would either damn them all or perhaps offer a path towards something resembling redemption. "We found it 3 days' ride south of here," he said carefully, his words measured and precise, "near the body of a young Apache man who'd been shot by Mexican bandits. We buried him proper-like, said words over his grave, and I took the pouch thinking it might help identify him to his people if we ever had the chance." His explanation tumbled out in a rush, desperate to forestall what he feared might be coming, while Jake and Tommy looked on with growing horror as they realized the implications. The dead Apache had been someone important to this remarkable woman, and their presence at this place and time was no coincidence. The silence that followed Samuel's words was profound and terrible, broken only by the stallion's restless movement and the whisper of wind through the desert scrub. Ayana's face had become a mask, revealing nothing of the grief and fury warring within her heart, but her hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the rope that served as the stallion's only restraint. Nalnish had been more than her brother. He had been her closest friend, her hunting partner, the one person who had never questioned her unusual gifts or suggested she should be more traditionally feminine. Now he was dead, killed by bandits while she had been safely at home, unaware that he needed her protection. The weight of that failure settled on her shoulders like a physical burden, and she felt the stallion respond to her emotional turmoil by tensing beneath her, ready to carry her wherever she needed to go. "His name was Nalnish," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within her, "and he was my brother." The simple statement carried such profound grief and controlled rage that even Jake felt tears prick at his eyes, finally understanding the true magnitude of what they had stumbled into. Samuel's face crumpled with genuine remorse as he realized he was looking at a sister mourning her lost brother, while Tommy made a small sound of distress that might have been a prayer or a curse. The desert seemed to lean in around them, the ancient stones and endless sky bearing witness to a moment of truth that would define all their futures. Ayana sat motionless on the magnificent stallion, a figure of terrible beauty and barely controlled power, while three white men waited to learn whether they would face justice, vengeance, or perhaps something else entirely. The stallion suddenly raised its head, ears pricked forward, responding to some sound or scent that human senses couldn't detect, and Ayana's attention snapped away from the cowboys to focus on the horizon where dust clouds were beginning to rise in the distance. Her trained eye immediately identified the cause, riders, and many of them approaching at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. She counted the dust plumes and estimated at least a dozen horsemen, too many to be another small group of cowboys or prospectors, but whether they represented rescue or additional danger remained to be seen. The timing was both perfect and terrible, offering her a way to escape this emotionally charged confrontation, while potentially putting her in greater peril if the approaching riders proved hostile. Samuel had followed her gaze and was reaching for a spyglass, his military instincts taking over as he tried to identify the nature of this new threat or opportunity. Through Samuel's spyglass, the approaching riders resolved into a mixed group that defied easy categorization. Apache warriors rode alongside Mexican vaqueros and what appeared to be U.S. Marshals, their unlikely alliance speaking to some greater purpose that transcended the usual racial and national boundaries of the frontier. At their head rode a figure Ayana recognized immediately, Cochise's son, Taza, whose efforts to forge peace between their people and the encroaching white settlers had made him both revered and controversial among the Apache bands. The sight of him leading this diverse group sent a complex mix of relief and apprehension through her heart, for Taza's presence meant that her brother's death had not gone unnoticed, but it also suggested that the situation was far more complicated than a simple case of bandits and murder. Samuel lowered his spyglass and looked at Ayana with new understanding, finally grasping that they had stumbled into something much larger than a chance encounter with a grieving sister. Taza raised his hand in the traditional Apache greeting as he approached, his weathered face showing the strain of a man carrying heavy responsibilities, but his eyes brightened with genuine relief when he saw Ayana safe and mounted on the magnificent stallion. "Sister," he called out in their native tongue, his voice carrying across the desert, "we have been searching for you since the sun rose. Your grandmother saw visions of danger in the smoke and sent us to find you." Behind him, the mixed group of riders spread out in a semicircle that encompassed the cowboys' camp, their weapons remaining holstered, but their readiness evident in every line of their bodies. The Mexican vaqueros wore the hard expressions of men who had seen too much violence, while the U.S. Marshals kept their hands carefully visible, understanding that any sudden movement could shatter this delicate moment of peace. Samuel, Jake, and Tommy found themselves at the center of a tableau that represented everything complex and dangerous about life on the frontier. As Taza dismounted and approached on foot, Ayana slipped down from the stallion's back with fluid grace, her feet touching the earth as silently as a shadow, while the magnificent horse remained perfectly still beside her. The Apache leader's eyes took in the scene with the sharp intelligence that had made him an effective negotiator between worlds. Noting the cowboy's defensive posture, Samuel's respectful demeanor, and most importantly, the beaded pouch that hung from the veteran's saddle. "I see you have found something that belongs to our people," Taza said in English, his words carefully neutral, but his meaning unmistakable. Samuel immediately unhitched the pouch and stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, offering it to Ayana with both hands in a gesture that acknowledged its sacred significance. The simple act carried profound meaning. The return of a dead warrior's possessions to his family, a recognition of Apache customs by a white soldier, and perhaps the beginning of something approaching mutual respect. Ayana accepted her brother's pouch with trembling hands, pressing it to her heart as grief threatened to overwhelm the iron control she had maintained throughout this encounter. The familiar scent of sage and tobacco, still clung to the leather, mixed with the subtle smell that was uniquely Nalnish's. And for a moment, she was transported back to their childhood, when they had raced horses across these same desert valleys without a care in the world. Tunza placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering silent comfort while also studying the three cowboys with the calculating gaze of a leader who must constantly weigh the potential for peace against the necessity of protection. "These men," he said carefully, "they treated my sister's brother with honor in death?" Samuel nodded gravely, his military bearings straightening as he prepared to give his report to someone he recognized as a fellow leader, regardless of race or nation. "We found the young man's body near Skeleton Creek," Samuel said, his voice steady and respectful, "shot down by Mexican bandits who left him for the buzzards. We couldn't let that stand, so we buried him proper with rocks to keep the scavengers away and said what prayers we knew." Behind him, Jake and Tommy nodded confirmation, their earlier shame at their treatment of Ayanna now compounded by the knowledge that they had unknowingly dishonored the memory of her fallen brother with their crude jokes. One of the U.S. Marshal stepped forward, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun, and added, "We've been tracking those same bandits for 3 weeks now. They killed a family of settlers near Tucson and have been raiding on both sides of the border." The information hung in the air like smoke, suggesting possibilities for justice that went beyond personal vengeance. Teza exchanged a long look with Ayanna, a silent conversation passing between them in the way of people who had known each other since childhood and understood each other's thoughts without need for words. She saw in his eyes the same desire for justice that burned in her own heart, but also the wisdom that came from years of trying to navigate the treacherous waters between Apache tradition and the changing realities of their world. "The bandits must answer for what they have done," she said quietly, her words addressed to both Taza and the marshals, "but they should face justice, not massacre." Her distinction was important, speaking to the difference between the hot vengeance of grief and the measured response of law. And Samuel found himself nodding in agreement with her wisdom. The stallion moved closer to her side, as if sensing that its rider needed support for what was to come. The senior marshal, a lean man with gray hair and intelligent eyes, stepped forward and touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Miss, if you and your people would be willing to help us track these killers, we could make sure they face proper justice under the law. Your brother's death won't be forgotten or ignored if we work together on this." His proposal carried risks for everyone involved. Apaches working with U.S. law enforcement was still a controversial concept, and the Mexican vaqueros might balk at crossing the border in pursuit of their own countrymen. But Taza saw the larger picture, the opportunity to demonstrate that cooperation between peoples could serve justice better than the cycle of raid and retaliation that had characterized so much of frontier life. Ayanna felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders, knowing that her choice would influence not just her own path forward, but the relationships between all the groups represented in this unlikely gathering. Jake finally found his voice, his earlier shame transforming into something approaching courage as he stepped forward to address Ayanna directly. "Miss, I know we got no right to ask anything of you after how we behaved, but if you'll have us, we'd be honored to ride with you and help bring those murderers to justice." Tommy nodded eagerly beside him, while Samuel's weathered face showed approval at his companion's transformation from bigoted fools to men willing to risk their lives for principles larger than themselves. The offer was unprecedented, white cowboys volunteering to serve under Apache leadership in pursuit of justice for a fallen warrior. Ayanna studied their faces, seeing genuine remorse and determination where hours before she had witnessed only ignorance and cruelty. The stallion snorted softly, as if offering its own opinion on the worthiness of these unlikely allies. As the sun began its final descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that matched the fire in Ayanna's eyes, she made her decision with the quiet confidence of a woman who had already proven herself capable of impossible things. "We ride together," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered assembly. "Apache, Mexican, American, united in the cause of justice for my brother and all those the bandits have murdered." She swung back onto the stallion's broad back, the magnificent animal responding instantly to her presence, and for a moment the entire group fell silent as they absorbed the sight of this remarkable woman who had transformed from the object of mockery to the leader of an unlikely alliance. The desert wind stirred around them, carrying the promise of the hunt to come, and the hope that from tragedy and prejudice, something better might emerge. Behind her, Taza smiled with quiet pride, knowing that his grandmother's visions had been true. Ayana had indeed found her destiny, not as the victim of other people's ignorance, but as a bridge between worlds and a force for justice in a land that desperately needed both.